Well, greetings fellow dwarfers. In my first video about the size of Red Dwarf, I said that Rimmer's little hiking holiday across the diesel decks, if those diesel decks covered just a few floors of Red Dwarf, he could have ended up in something the size of a county. I really recommend you go check out the original video if you've not already seen it, or if you just want a quick recap. So let's have a look today and just see how much massive, ludicrous internal space that huge, ugly wreck of a ship must really have. Now that ugly red trash can is a bit of an oddball in terms of shape, to put it lightly. So to simplify things for the maths today, and to save my sanity, we're going to chop off the front kind of pyramid-like shaped section at the front, and the kind of bit where it slopes down at the back towards the engine. We're going to just sort of chop those off and just make ourselves a nice hexagonal cylinder to work with today. So with things chopped down to a still ludicrous 3.3 miles of length, we can punch the numbers in for just the main hexagonal tube of the hull and quickly come up with an enormous potential floor area for the smallest decks of 5.69 square miles for the smallest decks, and for the largest we get an absolutely bonkers 11.385 square miles for those decks. Absolutely enormous. So adding things together and dividing by the amount of floors, we still get a ludicrous average size of the floors of 8.54 square miles per floor. 8.54 square miles for each of the 2,583 decks. This thing ain't small inside. In fact, our total ends up at a ridiculous 22,058 square miles of floor space inside the Red Dwarf. To really put that into perspective, if we take the total floor space and lay it over Britain, we end up at 40% the size of England, or about twice the size of Wales. Twice the size of a country. Red Dwarf is just crazy big inside. So even if we divide that space up for our 4 main crew members, they still end up with over 5,500 square miles each. That's some generous accommodations. Heck, even if we take the original crew count from the first series of 169, they still end up with 130 square miles each. The later crew count of 1,169, they still end up with nearly 19 miles of square space each. And even if we pushed right out to the crew count in the novels, 11,169, they'd still end up with almost 2 square miles each. So that's like the size of a really decent farm each. So even when we try and pack out Red Dwarf, it's still incredibly generous for size. Now this is the potential interior space. The actual interior space is going to be very different, because we're going to have interior walls, bulkheads, equipment, storage lockers, life support, computing, vending machines, and far more besides. So how in IO do we work out how interior space is really accessible for the guys? In truth, we can't. There's no real blueprints for Red Dwarf. I've never seen accurate internal drawings, but we could take some educated guesses. Let's have a look at some real world things that might give us an idea. Starting off, an oil tanker. These huge behemoths are absolutely massive, over 300 meters long. That's like the length of 3 streets. Absolutely huge. But despite having enormous engines, which are like 3-4 stories high, literally the size of a house, taking up a big load of their internal volume, their huge cargo capacity means that the internal volume still stays really high. At my estimate, I reckon only about 5% of the internal volume is taken up by engines, walls, plumbing and stuff. They're just so huge that there's still a huge amount of internal space. So let's have a look at a different example. How about a cruise liner? When these floating hotels aren't packed up with swingers and norovirus, they're absolutely chocker with all sorts of things inside. Loads of walls to make up all the different bedrooms, loads of bulkheads, furniture, vending machines, shops, spas, you name it, they've got it inside these things these days. absolutely chock full. By my estimate, I reckon about 25% of the internal volume is used up by stuff, leaving 75% that you could actually walk around in. So we could try and apply some of this to Red Dwarf, and perhaps we could say that Red Dwarf sits somewhere in between the oil tanker and the cruise ship, with Red Dwarf having big open cavernous spaces like the oil tanker, and Red Dwarf also having some pretty jam-packed areas like the cruise liner. However, before we go and pick a number in between the two, there's one more thing that's influencing my thoughts on how filled up the inside of Red Dwarf could be. Keeping in mind that we are only talking about the Red Dwarf ship from the early seasons, the first type of Red Dwarf ship, keeping that in mind, the recent episodes gave us a glimpse of something we've always suspected but never had really proven on screen. We got a clear diagram of Red Dwarf as a cutaway showing the engine, with the ram scoop being linked to the engine at the back by a pipe down the middle of the ship. Now this is something we always suspected about Red Dwarf, that the ram scoop and the engines must be linked. But seeing it confirmed on screen, okay, it's the later version of Dwarf, but still, it's kind of confirming something we already knew. Seeing it like this does kind of confirm it in my mind, and I think we can retroactively apply this to the early Red Dwarf. So taking into account that big tube down the middle of the ship supplying the engines, plus all the supporting material and the stuff that must go into running those engines, I think my earlier idea of splitting the difference between an oil tanker and a cruise ship might have been a bit ambitious, and really we should be looking at perhaps more like a good third of the ship being filled up with stuff, leaving us 2/3 or 66% of the ship free. I think that seems a realistic estimate. Our estimated average for the floor space for each deck drops down to 5.64 square miles, which, well, let's be honest, it's still absolutely ludicrous. 5.64 square miles per floor, 2,583 times. Yeah, it's a bit ludicrous. And even our total internal floor space still stays crazy at 14,559 square miles. Still crazy, and still slightly bigger than the land of Windsor Davis. It's absolutely nuts. For some comparison, here's just one of those enormous decks over London, over Cardiff, over Swansea, over Merthyr Tydfil. To put that into some more context, each one of those floors is about the size of a British town of about 15,000 people. So imagine for a second a town of 15,000 people. You have to explore every square foot of that town. So you've got to go into every house. We'll stick to the downstairs, but you've got to go through the downstairs of every house, every garden, every road, every park, every outdoor space, every business, every outside of every business, every single square foot of a town of 15,000, all those houses to explore, every nook and cranny. It would take you months. Now multiply those months by 2,583, and you can see why it's almost impossible for the guys to have explored every square foot of Red Dwarf. And you can see why, after 30 odd years, we've still got so many brilliant stories locked up in Red Dwarf. And the guys really could still be discovering stuff after all this time. They could find rooms they've never been in, somebody's quarters with a really interesting item, some science lab they've never checked out. There's so many stories on Red Dwarf that could still be told, because the thing is just so bonkers big. So there you go, fellow dwarfers. I hope you enjoyed this little look at the bonkers size of Red Dwarf, the bonkers amount of internal room, and how you've got basically a floating country. There's so much space that even when we tried to ram it full of crew members, like in the novels, 11,169 crew members, they still had a couple of miles each to play about with. Absolutely crazy. I'm gonna have to do my own video on my kind of theory for why it's so big and why the crew seems so small by comparison. I'm gonna have to do my own video on that, maybe a part 3 to the size of Red Dwarf. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure you hit subscribe and give us a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this one. Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you've got anything to comment, anything to question, stick it down below and I'll try and answer it. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this one. As I say, I think there's going to be a part 3 coming, so make sure you don't miss it. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time, Smegheads.